deny that it threatens Cuthbert's freedom. 4, interpreted in accord with our AN3-ish definition, simply says that C is a metaphysically contingent truth that's also true in any world that has the same past as our world. The Molinists can wholeheartedly agree, but note that this is compatible with saying that Cuthbert could have caused C to be false, and if he had caused it to be false, our world would have had a different history. If Cuthbert hadn't bought the iguana, God never would have believed that he would buy it. So the truth of 4, so understood, is innocuous. In the footnote, I point to another possible response. The moral, I hope, is clear. There is no such thing as the Molinist response to the argument because there is no such thing as the argument. Rather, there are a variety of formally analogous arguments that differ because of the precise understanding of AN that's being employed. And the best Molinist response to one version of the argument might well be quite different from the best Molinist response to some other version. These responses will, of course, be guided by certain fundamental Molinist convictions, that God has middle knowledge, that counterfactual power over the past is acceptable, but causal power isn't, and so on. But what these convictions imply for different versions of the argument is something we can discover only by looking carefully at each such version, not by assuming that the Molinist reaction to one version commits her to make the same response to a different version. In this section of my talk, I'd like further to illustrate and to amplify the moral I've just delineated by looking briefly at what is, I think, the most inventive and penetrating contemporary exploration of accidental necessity. I'm referring, of course, to the discussion we find in Plantinga's famous essay on Occam's Way Out. I won't have time to go into all the complexities present in this article. What follows is cherry picking at its most blatant. Still, I think it's an endeavor that will prove fruitful. Plantinga offers a series of increasingly complex analyses of AN, the complexities resulting from seemingly counterintuitive consequences attending simpler accounts. Let me remind you of just 3 of these. Consider first AN5. X is accidentally necessary at T if and only if X is true at T, and it is not possible both that X is true at T and that there exists an agent S and an action A, such that 1, S has the power at T or later to perform A, and 2, if S were to perform A at T or later, then P would have been false. This account has the disadvantage that far too few propositions, even ones that seem to be hard facts about the past, such as Abraham once existed, too few such facts turn out to be accidentally necessary, since it's logically possible that someone have counterfactual power over them. Plantinga suggests we slightly amend AN5 to AN6, and I won't read AN6. It has only 2 differences from AN5. First, in the 3rd line of AN5, we see a reference to an agent S and an action A. In the 3rd line of AN6, we have a reference to an action A and an agent S. This may be aesthetically quite significant, but logically it seems to make little difference. The only other difference between AN5 and AN6 is the necessarily that's added in clause 2. While Plantinga thinks this account has a number of advantages, for example, accidental necessity thus characterized as closed under entailment, he sees 2 remaining problems. AN6 would apparently let in even such non-basic actions as so acting that Abraham wouldn't have existed, and thus Abraham once existed would again not rank as accidentally necessary, and certain complexities involving cooperative ventures freely undertaken arise if we stick with AN6. So Plantinga moves to AN7. X is accidentally necessary at T if and only if X is true at T, and it is not possible both that X is true at T and that there exists agents S sub 1 through S sub n and actions A sub 1 through A sub n, such that 1 A sub I is basic for S sub I, 2, S sub I has the power at t or later to perform A sub I, and necessarily if every S sub I were to perform A sub I at t or later, then X would have been false. Note an interesting feature of each of these accounts. Metaphysically necessary truths turn out to be accidentally necessary. In this respect, Plantinga's accounts are quite different from the analyses that Freddoso entertains. Both AN2 and AN3 include clauses that allow only metaphysically contingent propositions to be accidentally necessary. Now, I think there are legitimate reasons for going either way here. If what one wishes to emphasize is the temporal aspect of the truths in question, that is, the fact that at some time the propositions in question come to be true and come to be fixed, then one should, as Freddoso does, specify that only metaphysically contingent propositions can be accidentally necessary. On the other hand, if one wants to spotlight simply their fixity, the fact that at the time in question there's nothing anyone can do about their truth, then one ought to let in metaphysically necessary propositions, as Plantinga's accounts all do. The decision one faces here should serve as further illustration of the fact that there is no such thing as the property of accidental necessity, but only a cluster of closely related concepts and properties. AN5 captures one such concept, one which in some contexts might be useful to employ, but which in the context of the argument is unhelpful, since far too few truths turn out to be accidentally necessary. AN6 points to a slightly different property, one which the proponent of the argument might find, at least initially, more promising. AN7 gives us yet another member of the family. Add a clause excluding metaphysically necessary truths, and we move to yet another branch on the family tree, one where Freddoso's analyses dwell. None of these analyses is really right or wrong. Deciding among them is simply a matter of trying to determine which member of the family will allow one to say most clearly what one wants to say, or argue most convincingly for the conclusion one wishes to support. Opponents of the argument, of course, think that there is no account that will do everything needed for the argument to succeed. That is, provide us with an argument that is clearly valid and sound for a conclusion that poses a genuine challenge to Cuthbert's freedom. Be that as it may, the crucial fact to recognize is that there are a number of different accounts, a number of different properties which proponents of the argument might plausibly try to employ. Before concluding, let me say just a word or two in favor of one account of accidental necessity that I think should be accorded greater respect than is often the case. Consider AN8. X is accidentally necessary at T if and only if X is true at T, and there is no action A and person S such that if S were to perform A, then X would have been false. This is an intuitively appealing notion of accidental necessity. It's basically the notion of something's being true, speaking loosely, no matter what. Or to put this slightly more carefully, of something's being true no matter what anybody might do. Often enough, one might think, when people are appealing to AN, this or something very close to this might well be what they have in mind. Plantinga mentions but dismisses AN8 because he says that under it there will be far too few contingent propositions that we have any reason to think them accidentally necessary. But is this really so? Presumably he has in mind cases such as those of Abraham and the Peloponnesian War that he had used in dismissing AN5. It's possible I have the power to do something such that were I to do it, Abraham would never have existed. Similarly, it's possible I have counterfactual power over the Peloponnesian Wars having occurred. Such examples do, I think, point to a serious limitation with AN5. Hardly anything ends up being accidentally necessary. But it's less clear that they point to a problem with AN8. Consider Plantinga's language when introducing the